before I start the presentation, given that I'll be doing it through a keynote, I just want to let you know, guys, that I'll be taking questions after the presentation is done. Every now and then I'll be stopping to see how things are going and, whether I'm going too fast or not. So I'll probably, within the first few minutes, do a little break to see how things are going. But other than that, without further ado, let's start. So the title of the presentation is Maker or Slaves, how our views around technology, leisure, and work determine our present and future. Now, it's important to point out that this was given in the context of the Athens Mini Maker Faire. So whoever is familiar with the makerspace, the title was indicative of the context in which the presentation was done. I'm going to use basically the concept of a maker to organize the presentation. It's going to become clear as I go along. But I'm going to start this presentation essentially with the concept of truth. And I'm going to do a little etymological analysis that will then help you understand what's the common thread between the different slides. In a sense, what I'll be doing with this presentation. So if you analyze etymologically the word truth, what you see is that it's essentially a negative. There's a negative prefix, a, in ancient Greek, and lithi, which means forgetfulness, right? So essentially, truth on a first reading means the condition under which things are not forgotten. That's on the first reading what it means. But if you go a bit deeper into the ancient Greek etymology, and you look, for example, at the verb from which lithi comes from, which is litholanthano, you will notice that it has three separate meanings. One of them basically is to avoid attention, remain unknown, and stay unobserved. The other is when we keep things hidden from ourselves. And the last one is when we forget things intentionally. And that's why, for example, the word for mistake, lathos, is something that is forgotten. So in some sense, what I'll be doing in this presentation is I'll be trying to bring to your attention some things that in some sense we keep hidden from ourselves or we forget intentionally, and make those things known. So that's kind of like what I'll be trying to do with this presentation. So I'm going to start off with the slave part of the title and go a bit deeper into that. So who is a slave? That's like the key question. So according to Algernon Sidney, slavery is something that might not be immediately clear, because what he wants to point out with this quote is that the weight of chains, the number of stripes, the hardness of labor, and other effects of a master's cruelty may make one servitude more miserable than another. But he is a slave who serves the gentlest man in the world, as well as he who serves the worst. And he does serve him if he must obey his commands and depend upon his will. So in other words, it doesn't really matter whether your master is good or bad. The important part is that you are under his will. So you're not a free man, but a slave if there could be interference that's contrary to your interests, due to your dependence on the arbitrary will or power of others. Now, this has some subheadings, like, for example, that the fact of dependence leaves you unfree to act at will, and that your awareness of dependence also serves as a further constraint. The fact that you know that technically you're under somebody else's will. Now, that's called the Neo-Roman conception of freedom. And throughout this presentation, because I'll be covering a lot of ground, I won't be able to go very deep into everything that I mentioned. But this is kind of like the key features of the Neo-Roman conception of freedom. Now, I want to focus a bit on the idea of something being arbitrary, just so that what you have on your screen is not like, this complete like conceptual things. There's some further depth into the actual terms. So any state interference not prescribed by law is arbitrary. And by arbitrary, we mean like based on a random choice or personal whim rather than any reason or system. Now, obviously, the question that comes to mind is, when are laws not arbitrary? When are they exemplifying being made by free men? So usually what the Neo-Romans would say is when they are legislated by independent citizens, equals amongst themselves, not based on personal whims, but rather being the outcome of a system of reasoned deliberation. And the result being that citizens, in obeying the law, are effectively obeying themselves, their interests and purposes, rather than the personal whims of another devoid of reason. I want you to remember this because as we go on in the presentation, we're going to focus on how important the aspect of independence is when it comes to being free. So keep this picture in mind because we're going to be using it later. Now, we're going to now focus a bit on the idea of the maker. And in Greek, I chose the word δημιουργή to translate maker. And it's interesting to go to the etymology to start realizing how important the word is, especially for the ancients. So the δημιουργή is made out of two words. One of them is demos, and the other one is ergon. What those are, ergon is basically a work or a deed, and demos is the body of citizens. So in some sense, when we're talking about somebody who is a δημιουργός, or in plural δημιουργοί, we're talking about those who work for the demos, for the body of citizens, those who create public good. Remember, basically, the idea of work being in a concept, and those whose work creates the demos, because in creating basically public good, you're essentially asserting something between the citizens. So in some sense, you're constituting the demos by having that status. Interesting enough, the word for creativity is δημιουργικότητα, which you see how political the word is from the get-go when we're talking about ancient Greek. So in some sense, creativity, using those definitions, is the capacity to create public good, if we were to remain faithful to the etymology of the word. Now, I'm going to now focus a bit on the concept of work. And what I'll be doing in the presentation is I'm going to take key aspects of the titles, go deeper into them, and try then to put them all together. So we did slaves, we did makers, now we're going for the word work. So work, basically, in different languages, there are many words for work. So for example, in ancient Greek, you would have the two different words. There's actually more, but I'm going to focus on those two. One of them is δουλειά, and the other one is εργασία. Now, δουλειά basically stems etymologically from δουλεία. That's why you see the accent there. And what's interesting is I'm going to show you basically the differences between those two using a bunch of diagrams, so you can understand how different they are. So here, basically, you have a task, and I'm going to be explaining what δουλεία is, or δουλειά, which is a modern version of the same word. I just want to point out though that technically δουλεία is slavery, but I want to point out those diagrams what exactly I mean by that. So here you have a task, and somebody is you have two people, right? So one of them basically is motivated by necessity to complete this task, whether that's internal or social, it doesn't matter. What's important is that he's motivated by necessity. The other one is actually in requiring that this task is done, he's merely exercising his freedom. So there's no clear-cut necessity with respect to the task itself. Another basically feature is that in performing the task, the person within the box is not necessarily performing something that he chose and is aligned with his purpose. Whereas, the task that is being performed actually is aligned and is conducive to the purpose of the person who's exercising the freedom. So in this sense, dulia, here you have the two different roles, right? You have the master, you have the slave. So dulia basically is when a task that you're performing is not aligned with your purpose and you're motivated by necessity. Whereas if you're not a slave and you're a master, essentially, it's a task that is an exercise of freedom for you, and it is aligned with your purpose. Now, interestingly enough, you see basically how for the master, in this scenario, what he's doing is a gracia, right? Because he's exercising his freedom, and the task is aligned with his purpose. So here you have the two differences, the two main differences of the two concepts. Now, here's another interesting part. Let's look at some further words and how they're connected now with Demiurgia. So, for example, gracia, you have something, for example, where it's aligned with your purpose and you're doing it out of freedom, right? So here's a man basically who's doing something motivated by freedom, and the thing that it's done is aligned with his purpose. Now, when he's doing with someone else, in Greek, you have a word for it. It's called synergasia, right? So you're sharing the same purpose and you're both free. That's the notion. It's embedded in the concept. And just to show it graphically, basically, it's like it means like literally like working with others. Now, what it gets interesting is that if this is done within basically a demos, right? What you have is syndemiurgia. In other words, you with somebody else is you working with others for the creation of public good. So you see how the concept of work and how we understand it, and the corresponding concepts, using the right concepts can mean completely different things. But many times we lump everything in like this concept called work, being ignorant that other languages have multiple concepts to specify the status of the people who are performing the different types of work. So the question, going back basically with respect to this notion, remember basically our notion of the slave, right? Now, here's something interesting. If you look at the Latin of what is a free man and a slave, right? And I'm going to connect this now with what we said with respect to work. Now, you have liber homo and servus, right? And in ancient times, the slave basically was connected with artes serviles, the servile arts. And what was connected with the free person? Well, the artes liberales, which were obviously the liberal arts, right? So in some sense, the liberal arts were the arts that were worthy of a free man, whereas basically the servile arts were basically the ones that were worthy of a slave. So the liberal arts were arts whose purpose is intrinsic and thus can be done for their own sake, that prepare citizens for civic participation and the creation of public good. In other words, for demiurgia. Whereas the servile arts, which obviously we don't use that, it doesn't sound nice. But if you look at the different examples, like philosophy and music with respect to the liberal arts, and then the servile arts, you see, what most people are trying to convince us to do, like get into business and all that stuff. These were considered to be the servile arts, arts whose purpose is extrinsic and are done for the sake of something else, that prepare slaves for a life of servitude. In other words, for the dulia, right? So, in some sense, like with respect to work, if you think about, for example, your position as an employee, usually your position as an employee, we might not be using the terms masters and slaves, but your position as an employee, you usually have to perform on some tasks that are not many times aligned with your purpose. If you're lucky, they are. And they were not basically a choice of your own freedom. You were prompted to them by necessity, so you're gonna make a living and so forth. So in other words, it's interesting how many people think they're not slaves anymore because they have a very graphic and peculiar sense of slavery, which is, we're in chains and people tell us exactly what to do and we can't do our own thing. But according to the Neo-Roman conception, from the moment you depend on the will of another, you're a slave. It doesn't matter basically whether, the chains are nice or not. And that's why I put the first quote. So in some sense, like the question becomes like, how can we go from slaves to makers? What's really necessary for that change? And here we're going to borrow a quote by Aristotle, where he mentioned in his Politics that if every tool could sense or be ordered to achieve its purpose, then manufacturers would have no need for workers, no masters of slaves. Now, before diving deeper into this quote, I want to point out that in original Greek, basically, it's not masters. He uses the word despots, and the despots, if you look etymologically, there's a reason why he's using that word. And but looking at the etymology, you can actually figure out what that reason is. So the reason basically is that in ancient Greek, despotis used to mean the master of the house. I mean, that's originally, if you go to Proto-Indo-European etymology, that's the original meaning. And the reason why he's using that word is because in ancient Greece, most of the economy consisted in private activity performed not in public, in the marketplace, but within the sphere of the family and household. Freedom only commenced outside the private economic household sphere. The sphere of freedom was the public sphere of the polis. And that's why even the word economy, right, comes from the Greek word economia, which literally means ecos, household, plus nemo, which means distributor management. So essentially, economy is the household management. Now, what's interesting is that people would think, okay, why was the economy something that had to do with the house? And what's going on really? And it's funny because other thinkers like Hannah Arendt would have quotes like the polis or demos was distinguished from the household in that it knew only equals, whereas the household was the center of the strictest inequality. To be free meant both not to be subject to the necessity of life or to the command of another, and not to be in command oneself. It meant neither to rule nor to be ruled. So in other words, basically, there were two spheres. One of them basically was a private sphere, and that's basically when you were supposed to take care of the management of your own household, which would allow you to become free in the public sphere. Now, you might remember the quote by Aristotle, where he talked about if every tool could sense or be ordered to achieve its purpose, then manufacturers would have no need for workers, no masters, or despots of slaves. Now, you might think I'm confused because on the one hand, what Aristotle is talking about is talking about a freedom that's very private. We're talking about basically the freedom of the despot. Whereas on the other hand, what Hannah Arendt and the previous quote implied is that there's another kind of freedom that's public. So in case you think I'm confused, the reason why this duality exists is because of a simple reason. Because necessity has two parts. One of them basically is natural or private necessity. In other words, you have to eat, you have to go to the bathroom, you need shelter. These are basically necessities that are natural and they're private. But on the other hand, if you were to, in other words, paying your taxes, it's not a natural necessity, it's a social necessity, and it's usually public. It's related, in other words, to the public sphere, usually a city or a state. So what Aristotle is saying is that technology, right, can liberate us from natural necessity. And whereas with respect to politics, politics is the only thing that can liberate us from social necessity. So in Aristotle's quote, when he talked about tools and being able to be autonomous in some sense, what he meant is that we can use technology to free ourselves from natural necessity. And the reason why the two are connected is because once you're free from natural necessity, this becomes a precondition for civic engagement. If you have 13 jobs or you're super busy, you don't have time for civic engagement. So if you are not engaged in politics, then you cannot change essentially where your country is going. So in some sense, what Aristotle is saying or implying is that if you're free on your private sphere, that allows you to become basically engaged in politics if you want to, and potentially change also the sphere of social necessity. And if you want to use modern terms, essentially freedom from natural necessity is necessary but not sufficient for liberty from social necessity, right? Remember, the etymology of liberty comes from the Latin licere or licere, which means to be permitted. So in other words, the whole idea of liberty usually permitted, of course, from who, right? So from your other citizens. That's the idea. So liberty kind of like implies society, and that's why I put it there. That's connected with social necessity rather than natural necessity. So now that we have all those parts come together, we can talk a bit more about the subtitle, getting into some modern figures and graphs, and talking about the everyday world rather than the conceptual world. So first of all, I want to introduce the idea of the maker as understood by Dale Doherty. And I want you to remember and compare it with the idea of the demiurgos, the ancient Greek one, and see whether you can spot the differences and similarities. So I'm going to basically play this video for you. This is from his TED Talk. Give me just 1 second.
So are you a maker? How many people here would say you're a maker? If you raise your hand, that's a pretty good, but there's some of you out there that won't admit that you're makers. And again, think about it. You're makers of food, you're makers of shelter, you're makers of lots of different things. And partly what interests me today is you're makers of your own world, and particularly the role that technology has in your life. You're really a driver or passenger, to use a Volkswagen phrase. Makers are in control. That's what fascinates them. That's why they do what they do. They want to figure out how things work. They want to get access to it, and they want to control it. They want to use it to their own purpose.
I hope that was heard nicely. I want to just double check in case some of you didn't hear it. Let me know whether this was something that you heard. Is it something that you heard? Do you guys manage to hear it? Please let me know in the chat. I'm gonna assume basically you guys heard it. So I'm gonna move. Okay, sound was fine. Great, thank you, Elsie. All right, so I'm gonna go back now to the presentation. Great. Dale here mentioned 2 things, right? Actually, I picked 3 things from what Dale mentioned, and I'm gonna focus on those 2 in the beginning. We're makers. That makers are makers of our own world, and particularly of the role that technology has in our lives. In case we're a maker, and we're either drivers or passengers. In other words, you can choose to be a maker or not to be a maker. If you are a maker, you're in control of your own world. If you're not, you're just a passenger in developments of others. And generally, this whole idea of control is one that I want to examine, right? So I want to read you this quote before getting into some concrete examples of whether makers are in control, right? So this is from Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, and this is what he says. To be unaware that a technology comes equipped with a program for social change, to maintain that technology is neutral, to make the assumption that technology is always a friend to culture is, at this late hour, stupidity plain and simple. Introduce the alphabet to a culture and you change its cognitive habits, its social relations, its notions of community, history, and religion. Introduce a printing press with movable type, and you do the same. Introduce speed of light transmission of images, and you make cultural revolution without a vote, without polemics, without guerrilla resistance. So in case this seems very abstract, I want to give some specific examples that demonstrate this quote and make us think just how much we're in control of when it comes to being a maker or living in today's world. So this, you probably seen this. This is basically an Uber car. An Uber car, give me just 1 second, I want to test something. Okay, great. So an Uber car basically is an autonomous vehicle. You see all this equipment on top of its hood, on its roof, that is able to drive on its own. So with respect to being a driver or passenger, obviously we're going to be passengers the way things are going. And in case you think this is science fiction, most of you will know that this made its debut September 14, 2016 in Pittsburgh. I think it has already started in San Francisco too. Just to make the point with respect to the Neil Postman quote, in other words, how technology has social consequences. Almost immediately, September 16th, the Vancouver Sun had an article about how techies propose driverless stretch of highway between Vancouver and Seattle. So in other words, in some highways, like you won't essentially be allowed to drive. This is like an obvious social consequence within the days of that announcement. So technology is not neutral. It has consequences, and they're very real and immediate. And I'm not so sure like who exactly is in control, but whether you're a maker or not, it's not always clear that distinction is what gives you control. Of course, it's not just taxis. Like, Uber bought the self-driving truck startup Otto, teamed with Volvo. That was August 18, 2016. In case you think this won't be hitting the streets anytime soon, it just did. In fact, it made its first delivery in October 25th, 2016. So this thing is happening. Also, remember, the jobs that are associated with those occupations, they're probably going to go away. And it's not just truck deliveries, it's also deliveries, like, mail deliveries, like, Amazon's, like different packages. I mean, this is the Amazon primary drone, and it's actually not even the first, it's not even the best version. It has now like a new version, which looks even better. And in case you think, I don't see when we're going to be seeing drones like delivering our packages, guess what? If you live in the UK, it's already happening, because the government just gave them the green light to test drone deliveries. So these things are happening right now. They're not going to be happening like 50 years. They're happening right now, and they're going to have radical social consequences very soon. In fact, they already have. This is an article by the MIT Technology Review, How Technology is Destroying Jobs. These technologies are actually going to have an effect on jobs. And for the first time since 1947, we're seeing something very interesting. You see on the first, on this graph, you have two lines. One of them is productivity, and the other one is employment. And usually, those lines go pretty much in parallel. But after 2000, you start seeing a certain divergence there. So in other words, there is higher productivity, but you don't have enough jobs being created to keep it in parallel. And sure, many people will mention that this has happened before in the past, industrial revolution, whatnot. But I want to point out that other researchers who are researching this, what they're concerned is the rate of technical change. The rate of technology is such that they're afraid that this technology is destroying more jobs than it's creating at this rate. And you can start seeing this on the data. Here's another data. Here's another basically graph. You can see the GDP and the median household income. Now, it's kind of like different, looking at that from a different perspective. The way to understand this graph, or at least one way, is to think about an example, for example, like Instagram. Instagram and Kodak. Kodak, at its heyday, I think employed around 145,000 employees. Instagram, when it got bought by Facebook with $1 billion, had 15, and it served 30 million users at that time. So essentially, I'm not saying that they're exactly the same companies, but technology allows you to do way more and serve an equal or even bigger number of customers with not as much like personnel. So that means that the wealth that's generated is concentrated in fewer hands. So you can see this basically in this graph. And if you look online, there's more data about this. And that's irrespective of the fact that the output per employed person has increased dramatically, at least in manufacturing. And you can actually see that there. So some people have noticed. Some people have noticed. Like Stephen Hawking wrote that if machines produce everything we need, the outcome will depend on how things are distributed. Everyone can enjoy a life of luxurious leisure if the machine-produced wealth is shared, or most people can end up miserably poor if the machine owners successfully lobby against wealth redistribution. So far, the trend seems to be toward the second option, with technology driving ever-increasing inequality. So there you have it. You have the introduction of leisure, and you have the idea that perhaps we can use machines to be all of us be prosperous. But in case you're wondering who's winning, it seems Hawking is right. And just to give you a figure of the magnitude of this inequality, here's an interesting figure. 2016 January, a study by Oxfam: 62 really rich people own as much as 3.5 billion poor people. And it's funny because only a few days ago, you actually had the update on the study. And in case basically you had hopes that this will improve, in the 2017 study, same one, you don't actually have 62 really rich people that own most of the wealth compared to you have actually 8. So in other words, in 1 year, it has gotten worse. And in fact, 8 people now own as much as 3.6 billion people. So this trend doesn't seem to be getting any better. It's actually getting worse. And again, some people who are really rich have noticed. This is a special report by Nick Hanauer, a billionaire venture capitalist. And he's saying the pitchforks are coming for us plutocrats. In case you don't know what pitchforks are, the classical symbol of agrarian revolution. And Nick Hanauer basically has a quote for us where he mentions that if we don't do something to fix the glaring inequities in this economy, the pitchforks are going to come for us. No society can sustain this kind of rising inequality. In fact, there's no example in human history where wealth accumulated like this and the pitchforks didn't eventually come out. You show me a highly unequal society and I will show you a police state or an uprising. There are no counterexamples, none. It's not if, it's when. So he's basically alerting his fellow rich friends that there's something genuinely wrong with this kind of inequalities. And to be to his credit, he has actually wrote I think a book with another co-writer called The Gardens of Democracy, where he also has a nonprofit where he talks about middle out economics, and he believes that strengthening the middle class and raising the minimum wage is a way to get out of this inequality. But what I'm more worried about is that the rate of technology will be such, and he's just one guy. There's a danger that the unemployment, the technological unemployment, will hit such a point where we're going to have another instance of essentially a Luddite uprising. I don't know if you know what the Luddites were. These were the people who lost their jobs in the Industrial Revolution. They started basically a revolt, and they went into factories and destroyed the machines, and they even killed some business people. And to understand that this was not just a small deal with a few people, at some point, the British Army had more soldiers fighting the Luddites than there were fighting Napoleon on the Iberian Peninsula. So, it has happened in the past, and if we're not careful, it can happen again. And it would be a shame because technology, as Aristotle reminded us, can be both used for our own emancipation or our own oppression. And it would be nice if we started basically advocating a different view with respect to technology. And this is in some sense like the positive part of the presentation when we talk about how makers and people who like technology sometimes repurpose it to use it for their own purpose, not the purpose that corporations or governments wants us to like use technology for, but for our own purpose, whether that's helping our fellow man or like liberating from certain issues. So I want to have Dale here talk a bit about how there's another way of seeing technology, which is not like negative, but is actually positive. And he talks a bit about it in his talk. I'm gonna basically put it.
But essentially, these are people that are playing with technology. Let me say it again, playing. They don't necessarily know what they're doing or why they're doing it. They're playing to discover what the technology can do, and probably to discover what they can do themselves, what their own capabilities are.
So, a good example is this Steve Wozniak and even Steve Jobs in the beginning. Like, there's a quote where he says, "I just loved going to the homebrew computer club, showing off my ideas and designing neat computers. I was willing to do that for free for the rest of my life." The homebrew computer club was this legendary club where all these technology enthusiasts would get together, exchange ideas, build stuff, and for them it was playing with technology. And this playing is not just idle playing, because Apple is became the most valuable company in the world. So you see on the one hand like a different way of seeing technology that not only is more healthy and you can use it for like different purposes than the ones that perhaps a corporation or a government will want you to use it for, but also potentially can result in a multi-billion dollar company. So in some sense, like what I'm suggesting is that we need to create the preconditions so that instead of having Luddites, you actually move to what Huizinga called the Homo ludens. Now, Homo ludens basically comes from the word ludus, which is the Latin for, you don't really have a strict translation, but essentially ludus is something that combines sport, play, school, and practice, right? So Huizinga thought that playing is the fundamental ingredient for the creation of culture. We're like fundamentally playful animals. And what I'm trying to suggest is that we should heed to Huizinga's insight. And I want to focus just on one part on how we can actually go further towards that direction rather than like creating Luddites, which might destroy technology and its emancipatory potential. So I want to focus on this word right here. Right. So school originally comes from the Greek word scholi, right? And I want to talk a bit more about that and how it relates with freedom and with like the Homo ludens. So scholi in Greek, in some sense, so you can say that scholi is equivalent to leisure, right? So it's interesting that like Hawking talks about creating a life of luxurious leisure. So he's saying essentially you're gonna have a lot of free time, and that's where his emphasis is. And I want to like indicate and emphasize how important this is, because scholi in ancient Greek is the state of freedom from both natural and social necessity, and the precondition for learning. That's its kind of like original definition. And what's interesting, sorry about that. What's interesting about this word is that originally that's what it meant, but then what happened is that, in some sense, the Greeks thought, okay, what is the best thing to do in that state? What's most conducive to learning? And usually they had this idea of like philosophizing and debating, and obviously this philosophers and debating happened in a specific place. So what happened in the genealogy of the concept, in some sense, well, we ended up with school, because school was the place where what was most worth spending your free time in happened, right? So that's kind of like the weird winding story of this concept. It started off by meaning this kind of state, then it started meaning what you do in that state, and then it started like eventually meaning the place where you do that thing, right? Now it's really interesting, because if you go back to Aristotle, you learn more about this concept. So for example, here you have like the politics, and you notice how, unfortunately, in translation it doesn't carry over very well, because in ancient Greek, the opposite of scholi is ascholia, but it's not business. So in other words, anything that takes you from that state is like, ascholia. So in other words, let's say, for example, you have like household duties. That means that you are in ascholia when you do them, and therefore you're taken from that state where you could learn. So in other words, it's not just business, but anything that takes you away from that state. And he thought that you try to do things to get to that state. So the necessary things, basically, and the useful things were done for the things that were noble, and he believed that leisure is the state in which nobility can be achieved. So imagine just how important leisure was for Aristotle. It wasn't just free time, like time that you can spend watching TV or Netflix, but it was a place, it was a state under which you could learn and achieve nobility and happiness. Now, how do you generate more of that? If that's the precondition for becoming more of a homo ludens rather than a Luddite, if that's the precondition where you learn, how do you acquire more of that? So in some sense, like my whole initiative about regenerating freedom is exactly centered around like one simple question: how can we use technology to create a system that any small group of people can assemble to achieve freedom from natural necessity, food, lodging, energy, etc., which is the crucial precondition for leisure, scholi, creativity, δημιουργικότητα, if you remember, and civic engagement. In other words, how can we make Aristotle's dream come true? Because if you remember throughout the presentation, he did mention that if you do, or he did imply at least, that if you do manage to use technology to acquire freedom, that allows you to use that freedom to engage in politics, civic engagement, which is the precondition for attaining more and more social freedom, right? Liberty. In other words, if everybody's working and nobody cares about what our politicians do, guess what? A lot of our liberties are going to start, disappearing through the encroachment of essentially, corporations on our civil liberties, or oligarchs are trying to basically curtail them for their own business purposes and so forth. So the less engaged citizens you have, the easier they are to control politically. Most of the liberties that we have acquired that were acquired through struggle and through concessions by the powers that be, because there was too much pressure on them. So they had to kind of like concede and kind of come to a certain compromise. So if you have people who are not free in the natural necessity sense, it becomes way more difficult for them to be free socially, because they simply don't have the time to engage in politics. In other words, what's really interesting with this concept, or with this like whole idea, is that it doesn't even matter what sort of politics you want, what political direction you have, whether you're right wing or left wing or center, it doesn't matter. if you don't have the time to engage in politics, you won't be able to achieve any political change. I'm talking about the obviously regular citizens, not the people who are independently wealthy. So in some sense, what regenerative freedom is kind of like an IKEA for freedom. I mean, it might sound strange, but like, you know, with IKEA, you know, what you do is you go there and you buy a bunch of parts and you assemble them and you have a piece of furniture. What I had in mind basically is you had like some sort of non-profit where you could download either the designs of different parts that you can then 3D print and assemble at your home, or perhaps even go to some sort of like a store, and you get all these technologies, and once you assemble them, you know, they become the preconditions for freedom. They are essentially the physical reply to Aristotle's dream. So in other words, these are the tools that know what your needs are and can be ordered to perform the work that's necessary. Because the truth is that if those tools do not perform that work for you, you're going to have to do it. And if you're going to have to do it, then that means that takes time from your civic engagement. So in some sense, if the tools themselves do most of our work, then we can be free to engage with not only our city and state, but with our friends, whether perhaps it could be our art project or anything that we want to do. Remember basically that the context that we're living in and what we see a lot of articles about, like, you know, automation taking away jobs, and many of them usually suggest the unconditional basic income as a sort of reply or as a sort of solution to the massive technological unemployment that's forecasted. But I want you to remember one very simple thing. The kind of approach that I'm suggesting here does not depend on the government. It only depends on you, your knowledge of technology and science, and essentially a few people, or even perhaps yourself, if you're really like if you're really industrious, setting up those technologies in a piece of land. And then essentially nature and technology work together to provide your basic necessities. You don't require the government, you don't require any subsidies, none of these things, according to basically the vision of regenerating freedom, which is one of the initiatives that I have. With the basic income schemes, the problem is that you're dependent on the government. So in other words, whenever you're dependent on the government, remember our very, very beginning. What is a slave? It's somebody whose will, whose freedom depends on someone else. So essentially, the unconditional basic income is not really unconditional because you're dependent on the government that's giving it to you. So what I'm trying to say is that if we go the route of the unconditional basic income, we risk basically walking on the road to serfdom, because we'll be dependent on the government. And the major definition of freedom and of like of not being a slave is to not be dependent on the will of another, not be dependent on the will of the government. So even though it sounds nice, I am raising the red flag with respect to the huge danger that the basic income has, you know, if it's implemented. And I'm suggesting an alternative route, which is way more decentralized, and it's only based on distributing the knowledge that is necessary from a technical and scientific point of view, so that anyone could, like, you know, assemble those pieces of technology and on a piece of land and acquire freedom from natural necessity. And then whether he wants to use that freedom to increase his civic engagement, or whether he wants to use that freedom to become an artist or whatnot, or get another job, or what, it doesn't matter. It's up to them. I'm not going to be the one to determine what they're going to do with their freedom. I just want basically to help towards the direction where people have a choice, have the freedom to choose, which is right now they kind of don't, because they have 2 jobs and they're still don't have enough time to like, you know, visit their family or do stuff that they like. I mean, if you look at all the stats in the past, like a single earner family could like buy a house, buy a car, you know, afford to raise a family. Now you have dual earner families that can't afford that. So obviously something is happening, something has gone wrong. And if you add that, the tremendous technological unemployment that many forecasters are predicting, we're going to have a problem. Where are all these people going to go? Where are they going to go? If you don't provide them with the tools to at least acquire certain dignity by just being able to survive, you're probably going to provide them to just escape social unrest with a basic income. But then that would make them more dependent on you. So then we're entering very interesting times, to quote the falsely attributed Confucian curse. So in case you don't think that these tools already exist, these are some examples. There are autonomous farm robots that are being built. Some of them work, some are still being developed. But it's not a pipe dream. You have all these technologies that can actually do the work for us and provide for our basic needs. And it's not just in farming. You have the same in housing. Now you have 3D printed houses. This is not just like a mock-up. I have a little video that will play soon. There's actually a machine that have been built that can build houses in the fraction of the time and cost that than the other like traditional techniques for building houses. So it is happening, and I would like to invite anyone who is interested in like exploring this to like contact me. But just before I close, I want to mention that it's not just Aristotle that had this idea that machines would could liberate us from necessity. Oscar Wilde, in a famous essay of his, wrote that if we manage to create machines that will do the work for us and free us to engage in science and philosophy and politics, we'll be able to usher a new Hellenism that was even better than the one that the Greeks had, because they had slaves, whereas we won't. So in some sense, this dream of machines like taking over the boring, burdensome work and us basically dedicating ourselves to our highest aspirations is a dream that has been dreamt for a long time. And I think with the technical capabilities that we have right now, it's achievable. And these are the kind of things that I'd like to be working towards, and also thinking about the philosophical, ethical, and political consequences of these massive changes that many people see coming for the future of humanity. So that's pretty much it. I want to mention that the regenerative freedom deals primarily with that, but obviously, this begets a question. So let's say that we do achieve through technology to achieve freedom from necessity, freedom from natural necessity, right? Is that enough? No, Aristotle actually believes that it isn't, because he says that if you have leisure, if you have free time, but you don't have the love of wisdom to go with it, love of wisdom basically in ancient Greek is nothing else than philosophy, then that leads to insolence. But insolence, if you look at the original, he doesn't use the word insolence, he actually uses the word hubris. So when you have free time and leisure, but you don't do philosophy so you can figure out what's worth doing with your free time, you are led to hubris. So the solution to avoiding hubris is philosophy. So in some sense, just like regenerating freedom and acquiring freedom from necessity isn't enough. Because you have to ask the question, what is it that's worth doing with one's freedom? And Aristotle suggested that philosophy is what you need to use to figure that out. So the second initiative that I'm heavily engaged in is this initiative called Philosophy Reborn, which is essentially deals with what should we spend our freedom for? What's wise? What should we do? What should we be doing? What's wise for us to do with our freedom, right? So that's basically the second initiative that's related to regenerative freedom. But of course, there's the last step, right? So let's say that I'm free and I use philosophy and I decide what is it that I want to do. The last step is doing it, right? I want to do what I decided to do as a free man. And in order to do that, you need the socio-political preconditions to do that. And the last basically initiative that I'm spearheading is called Φιλική Εταιρεία. Φιλική Εταιρεία was a secret society in modern Greece that essentially launched the independence fight against the Ottoman Empire, which is led to Greece's independence. So that's why I use that name for the last initiative, because if you don't have the socio-political preconditions that would allow you to do what it is that you want to do, you probably won't be doing it. If you want to, for example, start a business, that presupposes a legal framework. It presupposes a state framework. If you want basically to marry your partner who happens to be of the same sex, that presupposes, again, a social and a legal framework that would allow you to do what you freely chose to do as a human being. So the last initiative essentially is how do we change our socio-political structures to allow us to do what we've chosen to do, irrespective of which stage and place we find ourselves in. So in some sense, it's kind of like a political or meta-political, I would say. So these three things make up the vision of idealism in practice, and you can learn more about them at this URL. And that's pretty much it. This is my website and my Twitter handle, and that's when that's essentially the end of my presentation. And I would like to, for whoever is still with us after this presentation, I'd like to open it up to questions. So I'm going to stop my screen sharing for now and go back to hearing you guys. So let's go to the chat. Okay, great. All right, so now I can see the chat. I'm seeing a question. Jobs are a way of distributing money, thus ownership of rights, thus power. Please forgive the generalization. How would you suggest that distribution be done in a world without jobs? I actually didn't want to ask now, but wait for you to finish, but I accidentally presented. Okay. Well, first of all, you're welcome, Elsie. I just saw this other comment. I talked about the removal of jobs relating to our basic necessities. I really don't think we're going to be running out of jobs or an economy just because food and housing and some of these other things are going to be done by machines. I think we'll still use the kind of stuff that we have. It's just that the preconditions under which we do it are going to radically change. So, for example, let's say we have like me and you have robots that take care of our basic needs. I doubt we're gonna basically just stay home and watch Netflix. We're gonna be wanting to do different things, and there's gonna be a lot of things that could be done, whether that's maintaining the equipment or coming up with new robots or becoming musicians or becoming politicians. Remember, Aristotle said that in order to acquire social freedom, you need to engage in politics. So even if you don't have a job, that doesn't necessarily guarantee your social freedom. So you have to work very hard, whether you're gonna be doing it as a politician or as a worker in a non-profit or as a citizen. You're gonna have to work very hard to acquire social freedom. So I doubt there's gonna be no jobs at all. There's always tasks that people want to do, and I don't think we're going to be seeing jobs going away. What we are going to be seeing, as I said earlier, is some boring jobs going away. And the question we need to ask ourselves is, how do we want to organize our lives, given that we have the means to eliminate those jobs? And who do we liberate from the necessity of doing those jobs? And how do we instantiate that liberation? So there's a lot of questions that are going to that are generated by these developments. But the distribution, basically, I think that obviously capitalism is going to change with these developments, and there's a lot of books that I can recommend about post-capitalism and all that stuff. But I don't think it's within the scope of this presentation to examine how we're gonna basically do the distribution in a world without jobs, given that primarily I don't think we're gonna have a world without jobs. We're gonna have a world without boring jobs. But the distribution might be the same or new or like revised, because there's gonna be all these other jobs. So that's pretty much my response to your comment. Now, let's see. Are there any more questions? Let me see. Let's see, you guys. Google Hangouts. I see there's still 5 viewers. So if you have any more questions, you can type them in the chat in your YouTube, or perhaps post them on the Facebook group. Let me see if there are any there. Let's see. I'm not seeing any there. So just type if there are any more questions. Be happy to just write them in the chat. I can still see 5 viewers, as I said, and I'm just waiting if there are any more questions. In the live chat would be the appropriate place to type them. Okay, I'm not seeing anyone typing. I'm just gonna wait for another like 30 seconds, and if I don't see any other questions, I'm gonna wrap it up. Okay, I will think on it. Okay, I just saw a comment by Utkan, and feel free to send me questions by email or by Facebook if you're friends there, and I'll try to do my best to answer them. So if there's no more other questions, I'm gonna just wrap this up, and thank you so much for hearing me out, and I hope you have a beautiful day. Good night, guys.